The group stages have come and gone, and that well and truly means we are in the business end of this year's World Cup. That means exciting knockout football, and surprisingly, some of the most valuable national teams in the world have already been humbled and sent packing from this year's tournament. However, the world of football does not stop spinning just because the World Cup is in full flow, and back in Europe, some of the biggest clubs in the world are gearing up for another busy summer transfer window. In France, the reigning European champions, Paris Saint-Germain, are flexing their financial muscle and influence to swoop in and sign one of the most promising young players in the world of football at this moment in time. And never knowingly outstaged or overlooked, Jose Mourinho is back at Real Madrid to turn things around for Los Blancos, and he's already had a huge impact on the club's summer transfer activity. All that and more on this week's episode of Market Values. So, like just about every football podcast out right now, we are trying to weave our way through the World Cup. We're trying to discuss what's happening at it without obviously limiting ourselves to what's happening directly after we finish the podcast. That means some weeks we do discuss big topics in the World Cup, and sometimes we do focus on domestic football. This week, we're trying to do a bit of both. The second half of this podcast will be deep dive into big stories in France and Spain. But to kick things off, I'm joined by Manu, Veth, my co-host, to discuss two big nations already dropping out of this year's World Cup. Obviously, Germany were knocked out by Paraguay, and the Netherlands were knocked out by Morocco. And Manu, that means the fifth and the eighth most valuable national teams are now out of the tournament, one closer to your heart than the other, I think is fair to say. Let's kick things off with the Netherlands, because that's an interesting story. They're both interesting, but we'll start with the one that doesn't maybe tug on the heartstrings quite as much. Knocked out by Morocco. How do you feel about this result? I mean, I got to see Morocco up front, but not up close through my television screen, but obviously watching them from Scotland. But I'll let you jump in with your input on Netherlands first, and I'll maybe give my opinion on things.
So, those who have followed my World Cup meanders know that I also cover Canada at this tournament, right? And we sat together with a group of journalists after Canada's win against South Africa, and we were pondering on who Canada is going to play next. And I said it's going to be Morocco. So I'm maybe less surprised by most that it is Morocco that went through rather than the Netherlands. And that raised some eyebrows, and I feel very much vindicated at this very moment that I was right. It did come down to penalties. I think this is a very different story than the second story that we're going to talk about, Germany. The Netherlands went out against a really good team. I think that is just like something that you have to highlight here, right? It is not like that they got kicked out by some minnow and it was a huge surprise or whatever, right? Morocco is one of the dark horses at this tournament. They are probably Africa's best hope to win the first World Cup. And I think this game highlighted a lot of that. I recently spoke to Markus Krösche, the sporting director of Eintracht Frankfurt, that interviews up on Transfermarkt. And he said Morocco are the most European of all teams at the tournament who are not in Europe. And I think what he meant by that they're mostly European trained team. And they play like that. And so I personally wasn't hugely surprised by this outcome. And so is it a shock? Maybe not quite.
Yeah, we obviously had Ronald Karoff on recently to talk about Boadi, who's in the middle of that team, who's an absolute star in the making. And if you didn't know about him before this World Cup, you certainly do now. I think it's a really fascinating matchup. And you're absolutely right. I think Morocco deserved to go through. The game struck me Morocco's approach to the game struck me as a very similar approach they took to Brazil in their opening game, which I remember watching and thinking, quite surprised myself at how well Morocco dealt with Brazil. They have this very good kind of defensive system. They counter-attacked very well, but for large chunks of that game, they controlled the match against Brazil, which I'm not sure many people were expecting. Now, following on from that match, I then began to wonder whether Brazil were actually that good. And it's worth saying that, we were very close to speaking about Brazil on this week's podcast. And we were actually texting back and forth saying, let's try and scramble Marcus or Thiago to get on the podcast if obviously Brazil lost to Japan. And they came very close to doing so. But yeah, I think Morocco proved with this victory over the Netherlands that they are a team that'll be very, very difficult to beat. A team, I think, who are almost perfectly set up for tournament football.
Yeah.
They have this humility about them where they're quite happy to sit back, they're quite happy to sit off the ball, but everyone works so incredibly hard. The key players in that team, whether it's Siberia up front, Boadi in middle, or obviously Hakimi at right back, they're all very selfless, hard-working players, and that's what I just love about them. They're a very hard team to not like, actually, because they all work very hard for one another, all very passionate. And yeah, I think they match the Netherlands man for man. And I think we also have to talk about the Netherlands. They're obviously, I described them on last week's show as these kind of perennial underdogs when it comes to World Cups and European Championships. Everyone always kind of wonders if this was going to be the year they do it. I saw Ronald Koeman getting quite a lot of stick, Manu, after and kind of the reaction to this performance at the World Cup.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting when you look through the Netherlands kind of record. Obviously, in the group stages they got through to they beat Tunisia and Sweden, but they obviously struggled against Japan, and that was a game that I thought was really interesting because it felt very much like a game of two halves. And then you kind of look back at their form last year, and they kind of sailed through the World Cup qualifiers, but doing so, they beat teams like Lithuania and Malta, but they struggled against Poland in both games, lost to Spain in the Nations League finals on penalties. And I don't know, it feels like such a cliche or such a dull comment to make about the Netherlands, because I feel like it's the same comment people have been saying for the last 30 years, but they're just good to a point and not much further, it would seem.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think much like the second country we're going to talk about, and just to preamble this a little bit, I used to live in the Netherlands, so I know the country quite well. And for a long time, there has been a debate on whether this country has lost its identity a little bit, And I think the moment that you have to go back to is when they had that run in 2010. When they failed to win the final, right? The head coach at the time was Veth van Marwijk, and it was a very defensive, un-Dutch performance that almost won the World Cup against Spain. Very tight match, right? Iniesta scored really late. Then Louis van Gaal came in after that, and once again they had good tournaments, but he too actually didn't quite play the way that the Netherlands used to. And in this tournament too, Ronald Koeman, going through talking to people and friends from back then, he too, this is not what Dutch football used to be, right? Like someone complained to me that they play like what the Germans used to play, like. And that the Germans now play like the Dutch, which is also, of course, another point of debate, an interesting point, I think. But I think, it's an identity crisis. This team doesn't play like the Dutch used to play, and they kind of feel like a little bit lost in their system. And a lot of it also comes down to just trying to win games by individual quality. Cody Gakpo with the really sad background story that is happening, scoring an amazing goal. But, emotions and individual quality can only carry you as much so far in a tournament. And they played against a team that was far better structured. And it resulted in an exit.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, because they're obviously known in the past for having such sublime attacking flair players. Obviously Cruyff's the perfect example of that, but there's so many players going through the decades. You then look at this squad and you look at the most valuable players. The most valuable player right now, Ryan Gravenberch, defense midfielder. Okay, second most valuable player is Cody Gakpo. He's an attacking player, but I'd say quite a functional attacking player rather than a kind of flair player. Third most valuable is Reinders, who's a very ball-winning central midfielder. Fourth, Van de Ven, central defender. Donny Malen, fifth. Paul Van Hecke, sixth. Verbruggen 7th,
Yeah.
Hato in defence 8th. So the point I'm making here is that almost all the best players are defensive or industrious players.
Yeah.
Even with the best will in the world, like someone like Yan Diomande, who I've watched throughout almost his entire career, is a very effective centre forward when he has to be, but he's by no means a player that I would say is kind of going to get people off their feet.
Mm.
And if you actually look at their more attacking players, like your Somervilles, your Brobies, who we obviously touched on last week, your Justin Kluiverts, Noah Langs, guys that none of them are actually playing for top teams. They're all playing in the Premier League or,
Yeah.
Serie A or whoever else, but none of them are playing for top teams. And I do kind of think maybe if you'd go back 20 years, that would have been flipped. It would have been the flair attacking players all playing for the top teams. And then you'd have defense midfielders or defenders who are maybe playing for lesser teams. And
Yeah.
okay, maybe there'd be a top heavy team at times, but it just kind of strikes me as very interesting that the Netherlands have become this very kind of industrious team. And, I guess when they come up against a Morocco side who were happy to match them man for man in that regard, they struggled.
I think a lot of it has to do with who the Netherlands export their footballers to, right? They are building players for the Premier League or Serie A. And so you have these very one-dimensional physical players because that's what the Premier League wants. And, and I think there's actually some parallels again to the next country we're going to talk about. That, when you become this exporter, then you're limiting yourself to individuality. And I think there's a really big danger in how Dutch football used to produce players and how it produces players now, right? When clubs just become an export factory to produce one talent type because that's what's in demand. I think there's a big danger in that, and I think you're seeing it here. Of course, clubs have to live by their own. It's not necessarily their prerogative is to financially survive, not to produce players for the national team. Used to be different, but that's what it is now. But I think that is a really interesting underlying story that's going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. So it'll be interesting to see how they can get on and kind of get back on their feet ahead of the next European Championships. Obviously, if you're a Netherlands fan, let us know what you think of their performances at the World Cup. And, I'm just looking at that kind of under 21 list of players, man, of their most viable under 21 players. And there's Joro Hato, the left back for Chelsea. There's Keith Smith, who's the exciting young midfielder at AZ. But aside from that, it's maybe few and far between. So, obviously, if you're a fan of the Netherlands, let us know if there's any young players coming through that you think are exciting or where you think the national team should be heading after this. But Manu, another nation who will probably have to sit down and do a big post-mortem are, of course, Germany. Not for the first time. Quite, in fact, it's becoming more and more common. But of course, Germany were knocked out of the first knockout round on penalties to Paraguay. I'm not quite sure where we start with this one, Manu. I'm sure this has been kind of bouncing around your head since last night when the game happened. But what were your impressions of the game? What were your impressions of Germany at this World Cup? And then I guess after that, we can maybe talk about the reaction back home and where Germany go from here. But let's start with the here and now at this moment in time.
Where do Germany go? They go to the Netherlands to play the UEFA Nations League game there on September 24th. So, just to close the loop. I mean, it's this team, and I wrote a piece for Transfermarkt. It's up on the site, right? I called it a generation of failure because it is now 12 years since Germany have won a knockout stage game at a major tournament. Before this, I'm always pointed this out in the piece. Before this penalty shootout, they had never lost a penalty shootout. In fact, they had only ever missed one penalty in the entire history of the tournament. That was Uli Stielike in 1982 against France, and they won that game. So, it's just a tiny little footnote. I mean, this generation manages to all the amazing records that Germany have built until 2014, they managed to undo it all, and I also added to this piece that Joshua Kimmich, and I feel really bad for him, is sort of the face of this. He's the first player to reach 100 caps without winning a major trophy. I'm saying a major trophy because he was part of the team that won the 2017 Confederations Cup. But the fact is that in the last 10 years, the last good tournament that they played was the 2016 Euros, where they went out in the semi-final, unfortunately, against France, right? And so you really are looking now at a span of 10 years where things have been pretty bad, like really bad. And so you have to look at the root causes of that. And I think there are so many. Germany hasn't produced good strikers. Germany hasn't produced wide players. The only good defensive wide player in this team is Nathaniel Brown. Unfortunately, he can't play two roles at once. And I mean, it's a good sign that he is now emerging, right? Because he was genuinely, I think, Germany's best player at this tournament. And there's a good reason why he's going for a lot of money to Bayern Munich now, right? But other than that, I mean, it's full of disappointment from top to bottom. This entire team needs a really big rethink, and it also doesn't help that they went into this tournament with all their key players out of form, right? Florian Wirtz out of form, Jamal Musiala out of form, Kai Havertz through the tournament grew, but not 100%. Nick Woltemade totally out of form, and so Leroy Sané, a shadow of his former self, playing for Galatasaray. So I can't even say he's out of form. I think he's just not who he used to be. And so these are the players that Julian Nagelsmann relied on, and he also then made them play a tactic that just didn't work for players who were out of form. His reaction should have been, okay, well, we have a tactical problem here because the players that I need to play my tactic are all out of form, so maybe I need to adjust things here. And he failed to adapt to the process. He failed to understand what was happening here. And he failed to do so with a stubbornness that we haven't seen from a Bundestrainer since the end days of Joachim Löw. And I think that is something that he himself has to carry now, right? So I think there's a lot of things that are going on here. I have to also note that I think Germany, and to give a sliver of hope, there is a crop of young players coming up because they have changed their youth development strategy. But Nagelsmann left these guys at home. They were young players. And I said this before the tournament, I didn't think Germany would win this tournament. So if you don't think and you're realistic enough to understand that you're not going to win this tournament, you need to integrate these players that are the next wave. Like Said El Mala, Asamoah Traogo, he only is in the squad because Leonard Carl got hurt. Tom Bischofs, all these guys, they should have been in the squad. Jonas Urbik should have probably been your goalkeeper, And so I think there's a lot of it is not one thing that you can just pinpoint and like, this is it. This is the problem. I think there's so many issues going on here. And I think what you need now is a complete tear down and rebuild.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You kind of stole my question there in terms of, or the kind of moving on to, because I have the list of kind of under 21 stars for Germany, most viable under 21 stars in front of me, and top of it's Leonard Carl, then it's Said Al-Mala, Tom Bischoff, Finn Jelch, Karim Koulibaly at Werder Bremen, Asanu Drago, RB Leipzig. And most of those players were not at the World Cup, in one form or another. Obviously, if Leonard Carl picked up an injury, but Said Al-Mala kind of quite famously didn't get picked for the team. You can go further down there, and there's like kind of guys like kind of Icon who still have to kind of prove himself at Bundesliga level. But it's interesting that you then, if you look at that list and contrast it to the team that Nagelsmann picked for this World Cup, where you've kind of got a lot of old heads, Manuel Neuer, Sadio Mane, Leroy Sané, sorry. Yeah. Watching Leroy Goretzka come on to be this kind of bizarre goal threat in the second half of the match. And yes, I do agree with you that poor Joshua Kimmich is poster boy of this kind of failed generation, but equally, he's just kind of constantly held on to. Even someone like Antonio Rudiger, who I think is beginning to look quite old. I do kind of wonder if you look at this kind of period for the German national team since Jogi Löw left, and maybe even, as you said, in the kind of latter years of his reign, where he ushered in this new generation, and then he was replaced by Hansi Flick, who was a successor to the project rather than like a new blank slate, because he, of course, was Jogi Löw's assistant. and he tried to reinvent the tactics, and everyone knows that Hansi Flick has a very clear style of football. That didn't work with the players. And then Julian Nagelsmann came in, and he was supposed to be this breath of fresh air. He was supposed to be this, Das Reboot 3.0 or whatever. And he hasn't really done that. He's just kind of stuck with many of the players who were even still around under, Jogi Löw. And it's made me kind of wonder, Manu, and I'm not quite sure what the reaction has been in terms of Nagelsmann's position, but if we kind of look at where Germany have failed since Jogi Löw, and it's easy to forget that he himself was a relatively unknown quantity before he became the German national team head coach. I wonder if that's what Germany have to go back to. They have to go back to a rather unassuming head coach who, instead of kind of walking into the dressing room with his own ego and his own tactics board, he's going to take a look at the young players he has to hand and try to get the best out of them, rather than thinking, how do I crowbar Leroy Sané or, Manuel Neuer into this team to help me, the head coach, go win a World Cup or European Championships?
I mean, I don't have an answer to who's going to be next. I know who wants to do it, and that's Jurgen Klopp. He's positioned.
Let me guess, do his teeth glow in the dark?
Yeah. His teeth glow in the dark. I'm not sure whether the public has an appetite for that, an appetite for him to become the next Bundestrainer. I'm also not sure he's the right guy because.
Well, hold on. What makes you say that, Manu? Explain that for people who maybe don't follow German football or what's going on in the country.
Whether they have an appetite for him. How I'm going to put this the best way. I think there is the way he's presented himself lately, and the whole Red Bull thing doesn't make him exactly a person of big sympathy. And the fact that he positioned himself to be the successor during this tournament wasn't really exactly well liked by a lot of people either, right?
So just to fill people in, he's basically the head of Red Bull, which is the most hated football club in Germany. Yeah.
And then, of course, he did make comments about wanting to be the successor, like underlying kind of comments saying, Julian Nagelsmann is making the team selections, for now, right? When we don't know what's going to be happening in September. And that was, these outside noises were also a big reason why this team, I think, failed, right? There was so much noise around this team that were really hard to isolate this team from. And he was part of the problem. And now you want him to be part of the solution. I think that's really difficult to sell to the public, right? I think the public want maybe something completely fresh in you. And I also actually wonder if you want maybe a fatherly figure. I like what Carlo Ancelotti is kind of represents at Brazil. You need maybe someone like that. I jokingly said Rudi Völler. He's not a new face, but I think he's more of a fatherly figure that can maybe just, is more willing to actually also experiment. I'm not saying it's going to be him, but I think you need to maybe find someone like him who's also a new face.
Yeah, it's an interesting show. And I think the Ancelotti comparison is an interesting one because I think Ancelotti is obviously a master at getting the best out of players, getting them to believe in themselves, also making sure they don't panic. You can say what you want about Brazil this World Cup, but they are beginning to resemble more and more his Real Madrid side, where they just kind of walk through matches until something magical happens. And people don't understand how they do it, except for the fact that they always seem to do it. So there's that kind of gold dust about them. And I must admit, watching Germany under Julian Nagelsmann, it's the complete opposite. The players don't rise to the occasion, they shrink from it. Yeah. And I'm not sure if that's because of the way Nagelsmann coaches these players, or maybe it's just the players themselves. Maybe it's just a certain group of personalities that means that there's a lack of leaders in that team. But I think I probably agree with you. I think it's hard to argue that Nagelsmann has been getting the best out of these players during his time as a German national team head coach. And while I think you could make a very strong argument that Germany don't have the same depth of talent as maybe a France or a Spain or maybe an Argentina or something like that, well, maybe not Argentina to an extent, but certainly Spain and France are obviously the two big ones.
Yeah.
I think they have to be careful, Manu, because we're now talking about 3 World Cups in a row here, including a few dodgy European Championships. And while they're still getting to tournaments, they only have to look to the southern border or look over the southern border to a team who have just as illustrious a history in football, but are astray. And of course, talking about Italy there. And so, how do you think Germany can avoid that kind of fate? How do you think they can stop the rot here and kind of get back to being the Germany they were before?
Yeah, it's an identity crisis, isn't it? I think it's also really interesting when you look at the youth teams. They're winning tournaments, right? The youth teams are quite successful, and then they get to this level, and then they're all of a sudden not. Whereas in the past, it was actually almost always the other way around. And I think that too tells me that the talent level isn't necessarily the problem. Italy has a talent level problem, and we speak to Yatin Dietl about this, or our colleague Stefano Bonfino, that they will point this out. I don't think Germany has that problem. They have a problem of integrating the talent in a system that has a clear identity. It's an identity crisis and not a talent crisis. Of course, there's more nuance to it than that. But if I would go into more nuance, we'll be sitting here for another hour, Stefan. But I think that is a big difference between the two countries. That it is, as odd as the sound, Germany do not have a talent crisis. They don't know who they are. And I think that's almost a harder thing to fix. Italy can just go and okay, well, we have to reboot our talent development system like Germany did for this first reboot, right? We just need to produce talented players and then we're going to be back. Germany is well, we're producing talented players. Why are they not playing well? That is hard to fix because I don't have the answer. Julian Nagelsmann doesn't, who's supposed to be one of the most qualified coaches in the world. Rudi Völler, who's carried one of the least talented teams in the history of Germany to a World Cup final, doesn't have the answer. That is extremely hard to fix.
Yeah. Well, they might be on the lookout for a new manager, but I can tell you for a fact who it won't be Manu, and that's Jose Mourinho, because he has joined Real Madrid. And there we go for a segue. And you sat down this week with our colleague Ivan Fuente in Spain to discuss his return to Real Madrid and what that means for the Spanish Giants, for La Liga, and of course European football as a whole. And perhaps, as I noted, the future of Cristiano Ronaldo in the Portuguese national team. So we'll put a pin in the World Cup for now and head to Spain and see what Ivan has to say.
And I'm now joined by Ivan Fuente, our content manager in Spain. Ivan, how's it going?
Hi, Manu. How are you?
Yeah, good.
Really warm here in Spain those days.
Yeah. It's a very, very busy time for everyone at Transfermarkt between World Cup and transfer season and everything else that's going on. You would think that June would be a little bit quieter, but here we are. And Ivan, I tell you what, it is June 25th when we record this, and the transfer window isn't even open.
Yeah. It's crazy.
So there's a lot more to come. But the reason why I wanted to talk to you today is Real Madrid. They're bringing back Jose Mourinho, and I looked at his stats profile on our site on Transfermarkt, and what a career, right? Started as an assistant manager at Barcelona, then he was briefly at Benfica, then he was in Lera in Portugal as well. Really burst into the scene at Porto, 2.32 points per game average. That remains his highest to this day. Then went to Chelsea, then went to Inter, won a Champions League with Inter, don't forget that, against Bayern Munich in the final, right? And then pretty much that night left the club to join Real Madrid, where he had his second highest point total with 2.30. Then followed a second stint at Chelsea, Man United, Tottenham, which I almost forgot that happened. Seemed like a fever dream. Roma, Fenerbahce, Benfica, where actually he did pretty well, 2.02 points per game, and now a second stint at Real Madrid. Ivan, when you heard about those news, what went through your mind?
Well, obviously, I think, or at least most of the people think, the best moment of the career of Mourinho is already past. But when I see that, I saw that Mourinho signed for Real Madrid, it comes to my mind when Ancelotti came to Real Madrid for the second time. His career wasn't in his prime either, because he spent a couple of seasons in Everton, Napoli, where he didn't do that well. But his career in Real Madrid after that was successful, really massive for Real Madrid fans. And, I'm not saying that Mourinho is going to do the same, but it's football. You never know. Real Madrid is a big club, and Mourinho is a really good coach.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a really fair point. I do also wonder, Ivan, if Real Madrid are one of those clubs where when they go for a younger, more experimental coach, like they did with Javi Alonso, who's obviously a good coach, don't let the things that happen at Real Madrid blind you. I think he more or less stumbled over the internal politics of the club rather than his ability as a coach, right? And so you almost need like a general in charge of the club, which Carlo Ancelotti is, and I think Mourinho is very much as well. So I think that's maybe also another reason why they went for him.
Yeah, for sure. You need in this kind of club, you need a guy, a coach that really knows where he is and really knows how to keep the calm when everything is around you crazy and you are in the middle of the storm. And in this club, it's almost every day like this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was the thing that I'm really curious about next though is he's already made some signings, or I guess Real Madrid have made some signings. Marco Corella joins from Chelsea overnight. Wow, that was so quick.
Yeah.
It went from this is not a story at all to he signed, I think in like 7-8 hours. Then Ibrahima Konaté signs as a free agent from Liverpool. Real Madrid love free agent signings. They wait out until the contract of a player expires and then they get that player. Same with Bernardo Silva. He joins as well. And Endrick is supposed to come back, right? He's currently playing with Brazil at the World Cup for Carlo Ancelotti, I should say. So he's coming back. And then there is also Denzel Dumfries. That is not a confirmed deal by the time of recording, but I think Ronald Koeman said with the Netherlands camp that he expects this deal to go through. What do you make of these transfers?
Well, obviously, Mourinho is okay with all these transfers because if not, Florentino Perez would never sign them. Since Mourinho is the coach Florentino wanted for the job, so for sure Mourinho is okay with all these players. And the first things you see, apart of Bernardo Silva, all of them are defenders. And I think it's a really good point because Real Madrid had a problem in defense last season with the injuries. Players like Alaba or Rudiger where whose better games has already passed, and you need a new players who can reach a top level right now.
What do you make of the Cucurella signing? Is that a sign maybe that Ferland Mendy is not expected to come back and reach his potential again? Because other than that, they have Fran Garcia, Navarro, Carreras. I guess that's really just trying to have a top left back there, eh?
Yeah, for sure. And in Spain, some media has already published that Mourinho doesn't like Fran Garcia, and he didn't expect Mendy. So many injuries. Not you can't trust in a player. You can't trust. This kind of players. You always feel like at some point he can't have a new injury, so you are without him for a while. And yeah, Cucurella is a top one. Alvaro Carreras is a really good one too, but I think Mourinho needs a player like Cucurella who can defend really well, and also he can do some good things in attack.
Yeah, I think, the signing of Konaté speaks for itself. You mentioned Antonio Rüdiger is getting older, right? And I'm Eder Militao currently injured as well. He has been struggling for some time. Dan Huijsen, talented, but probably still needs some time to get there as well. And Konaté, I mean, he can be so incredible, right? I think a lot of clubs in the world, like Bayern and PSG, tried to sign him as well and had no chance. So yeah, I think his signing probably makes the most sense of all of them.
Yeah, for sure, because Hausen, I think, is a really talented player, a good defender, but he's young. He needs to make mistakes and don't charge on his back the all the defense of Real Madrid. He can't be the main defender of Real Madrid. He needs another mate to the side and his side to play better than he did this season. And yeah, I think once the Real Madrid has buy some players for defense, maybe he needs to think in the midfielder or also in attack, where you say, okay, they have Vinicius. His World Cup is amazing. Kylian Mbappe is better, even better. Hendrik, Franco Mastantuono, Rodrigo, who is injured now, but there are big names there. But they are still thinking in Michael Olise. So maybe Mourinho wants a really top player with them in attack.
So how do you fit all these guys in? I mean,
I'm not Jose Mourinho. I'm not Jose Mourinho.
Yeah, because some players will have to be sold. I mean, Dumfries comes in. I watched Jude Bellingham, for example, play for England, and I thought, wow, he's not what he used to be. He's really struggled the last few years. And Real Madrid are not the sort of club that hangs on to players who are not at the top performance. I remember when Mesut Özil was there and he had one not so good year and boom, gone, right? Off to Arsenal you go. It's really kind of interesting. So do we expect them to sell some players? I mean, Rodrigo has been linked for a long time. I'm thinking of Arda Güler, Jude Bellingham. These are all names that I'm thinking something's got to give, right?
Yeah, for sure they are going to sell some players like Fran Garcia that we mentioned before, Ceballos, and maybe Hendrik, Rodrigo, who still has a good market over there, but they are not in his best moment. But in the last days, some media in Spain has published that Vinicius hasn't renewed yet his contract with Real Madrid, who's going to finish in 2027. So this summer, if he didn't sign a new contract, this summer is the last time for Real Madrid to sell him for a good amount. So maybe he's the elephant in the room of the Real Madrid market.
I mean, he's also was the internal problem for the club, right?
Yeah. With Xabi Alonso, probably he had a problem. I don't know if a personal problem. At least they don't mix very well.
Yeah. Yeah, no. You know what I wonder too with Vinicius Jr., who's going to buy him though? Who's going to buy Vinicius Jr. for the money that Real Madrid want?
Arabia? I don't know.
Saudi Arabia, yeah.
They are the one who has the money and they can, because if you think in the biggest team in Europe, right, they don't need them. Well, always there is a club like Manchester United who has a lot of money and they can buy a superstar like Vinicius. But I don't think they need him now. They probably need another kind of players to build a team to make they come back to the big team, one of the biggest team in England. So I don't know. Probably Saudi Arabia is a place where they have the money and they can offer Vinicius the money he wants to move there.
I mean, he's only 25, right? You would think that he's a little young for Saudi Arabia, but we've seen it now a few times that players even at a younger age go because the money is so big, right?
Yeah, and we can't judge them because they have his reason to do that. Even we expect them to be in the biggest team in the world and to be playing Champions League. But his career. They have to do what they think have to.
How do you think this is gonna go this time with Mourinho?
I don't know. I don't really know because there are some things that we need to see how he's gonna deal with that. He's not the coach that he used to be in the press conference. He is not that aggressive than he used to be. If you have seen the press conference of him in Benfica,
yeah,
he was calm. He looks like, okay, I'm not agree with you, but I'm not gonna fight with you in that room. But he also has his character for sure. We can change what we are. He either, but that's a point that we need to see how he's gonna be in Real Madrid in this time. And also, Barcelona was a really good team, a powerful team last season, but wasn't the Barcelona of Pep. Was not this kind of team that you see they are not gonna lose. Now there is not this kind of football team in Spain. The La Liga is open between these two big games, but one of them can win easily. And if Mourinho wins La Liga, it's not a bad season for them. They always expect to win the Champions League, but it's not easy. It's come on. This is the biggest competition in the world, and you can't judge a season just if you win Champions League is a good one. If not, it's a poor season. No, I don't think it's unfair.
I think he still would be the first coach to win the Champions League with 3 different clubs. Yeah, he's won it with Porto. He's won it with Inter in 2010. And I can't think of anyone else who has won the Champions League with 3 clubs. No, he would be the one.
That's a really good point, because that's a strong thing to push him to do his best.
Yeah, I mean, that is the storyline, isn't it? If he can win the Champions League with Real Madrid, what else would there be to do?
Win something with Portugal. That's when he signed for Benfica. Yeah. Some people in Portugal says that Mourinho went to Benfica to like a step before to get the national team.
Yeah,
but that cannot happen for now. So maybe it's a thing that he still want to do at some point.
I think Jose Mourinho would be the only person brave enough to retire Cristiano Ronaldo to win something with Portugal. So, because I think that's what it would ultimately take for Portugal to win something again, is for someone to be brave enough and tell Cristiano maybe it's time to sit on a bench.
The thing with Cristiano is his number still means something, but not as much as he thinks.
Yeah, absolutely. Ivan, this was great. Thank you so much for joining us. And really curious to see how this is going to work out. I can guarantee one thing: bring a big bag of popcorn, because it's going to be cinema. Yeah. It always is. All right. Until next one. See you later, Ivan. Cheers.
Bye. See you.
Away from the crazy drama of the World Cup and some major giants stumbling at the first knockout round, we have to return to domestic football, particularly in Europe, where there's a lot of business being done between the biggest clubs in Europe. And one of the biggest names, Yan Diomande, who we spoke about a number of times since we started this podcast, has dramatically, according to reports, decided to turn down an offer to Liverpool, and now looks set to a move to Paris Saint-Germain. And to discuss all that and maybe what Diomande arriving in the French capital means for the European champions, I'm joined once again by my good friend Stefan Tan from the French team. Stefan, how are you? And thanks again for joining us on the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's always good news for you when we have you on the podcast. It's either, discussing PSG getting to the final of the Champions League or today discussing them potentially signing one of the young, one of the most impressive young players in European football. But let's get started with that, I suppose. So I don't know what the French perspective on this would be, but in England or in the UK, Liverpool have been pursuing the signing of Diomande for a number of weeks. It seemed as though they were going to match the figure that Leipzig wanted for him. And then all of a sudden, it seems as though PSG have swooped in and convinced the player to move to France instead. How has the reporting, how has the coverage, how has the reaction been in France and among PSG supporters?
So yeah, as everybody know, Yan Diomande at just 19 years old is one of the most exciting player right now. He was one of the biggest revelation of the Bundesliga with an incredible season. And the Ivorian winger ticks every box of Luis Campos and Luis Enrique look for. He's young, he's already productive, with a huge room to grow. And yeah, I think it just shows how PSG is now one of the biggest club in the world. They just won back-to-back the Champions League. Now PSG has a very great attractivity from the young players. And yeah, as I said, Yan Diomande is one of the most attractive and exciting player. We see it in the World Cup with Ivory Coast. So yeah, PSG and Liverpool were fighting for this player, but even if Liverpool I think are proposing more money, the fact that Yan Diomande seems to choose PSG show that now the PSG are in another dimension, and yeah.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing to me about this deal is not just that, the European champions, so the best team in Europe, are going for one of the best young players in Europe. That's obviously something that happens all the time. But the fact that he's one of a number of young players that PSG have signed over the years, Desiree Doué, Barcola, Kvichakara, and number of, defensive players, midfield players as well. And we have an article on Transfermarkt on the English domains looking at how PSG's transfer policy has changed. And there seems to be a reflection point or a moment in history where things changed, Stefan, for PSG, which was in 2023, the summer of 2023, when the club had sold Neymar, Lionel Messi had left, and perhaps most importantly, Mbappe announced that he wasn't going to sign a contract extension and he was going to move to Real Madrid. And since then, it seems as though the club have made a renewed focus to, instead of signing older players like Messi, Sergio Ramos, Buffon, you can go all the way back there, Dani Alves, etc. They've made a very clear change to signing young players. What was the reason behind that? Did they maybe change the people in charge of the recruitment team or the strategy? Or was it just the club as a whole said, okay, we have to change our strategy here?
Yeah, but as you said, we have to go back at 2023 when PSG was all about big stars near the end of the careers or already at the top. We can name a lot of players like Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Mbappe, Neymar, Messi. But even with all that talent, the club never won its first Champions League. And it's important to say that it was not a failure. It was a needed step, I think, signing a big star like this player that I mentioned, help PSG to become bigger, more respected as a club around the world. And it also raised the standard inside the club. I think without that period, PSG wouldn't have the reputation or the facilities needed to attract the best young players today. The real change came when Luis Enrique and Luis Campos arrived and rebuilt the whole system. And the goal was simple: build a team where every player works for the group, not for himself. And so now for 2.5 years, we saw that PSG has been moving away from buying big stars and instead, as you said, focusing on only young players, promising players who can grow into something special at the club. I think now the PSG didn't recruit Ballon d'Or. They recruit young players that it can become a Ballon d'Or. For the fact that they chose young players, I think young players, you can shape him in the way you want. He doesn't come with a big ego like Messi or Neymar. He's like a blank page, ready to learn from Luis Enrique. And yeah, Luis Enrique is he's trusting young players. He's renowned to be one of the best coach in the world. So everybody wants to join PSG to play for Luis Enrique, to play with his philosophy. And we can see we have a lot of example of young players who came at a very young age at PSG, like Nuno Mendes or even João Neves. In just 1 or 2 years, they improve a lot. So yeah, that's one of the main reason that they young players now choose PSG instead of big club. And we can say that PSG have one of the most exciting project. The average age is only 24 years old. So the PSG already won 2 Champions League. I think the project is to win more and more in the few years, and even in 3 or 4 years, the PSG team will only be 27, 28 years old. It's in football, we said that the age of maturity. So, and now the PSG already won 2 Champions League. So yeah, for young players, it's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I noted in that article that during the Champions League final, the average age of both starting 11s between PSG and Arsenal was almost identical, but the average age of the PSG bench was about 5 years younger than Arsenal. So that shows how many young players they obviously have in that squad. I wanted to pick up on something you said there about Luis Campos and Luis Enrique. And, obviously Luis Campos is in charge of recruitment and the sporting project. And obviously everyone knows who Luis Enrique is. How vital are those two people to these 2 Champions League successes for PSG? Do you think PSG could have won the back-to-back Champions Leagues or European Cups if Luis Enrique wasn't there or Luis Campos wasn't there to scout and sign these players?
Yeah, these 2 guys are, I think, the most important people of PSG project. Luis Campos, his mission is to scout, to buy players and sell players. During the first years of the project, we saw him depensing a lot of money, but it didn't work as expected. There is a thing which is very important, is the connectivity between both of them. They like each other. They love to work with each other, and there's a thing in the recruitment process is the player had to want to join PSG at 100%. If the player are not willing to play for the PSG jersey or willing to really play for PSG, Luis Enrique want the players, and that's the same for Yan Diomande. If at the end he wanted to play for Liverpool, PSG wouldn't go for him. And it's the same strategy for several years now. Players really need to want to join the PSG before the PSG go for them. Yeah, I think Luis Enrique has a key role in PSG. He's known for trusting young players even before joining PSG. At Barcelona, we saw he give a chance for young talent from the Masia without hesitation. As a Spain coach, he made the bold choice to start with Gavi, a very young players, and he does the same. He does the same thing at PSG. Young players aren't left waiting on the bench. They play and they play with important matches. We saw it. The players last year in PSG who played the most was Warren Zaïre-Emery. Unfortunately for him, he didn't play the final, but he was one of the player who played the most. So yeah, I think these two people are so important for PSG and are one of the biggest key for PSG's success today.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And as you said, you can understand why someone like Diomande would look at all that and say, that's the perfect club for me, because not only are PSG challenging for major titles, but they have a head coach who prioritizes minutes for young players. My only question, Stefan, is how does Diomande fit into this team? Because PSG have just proven that they have a squad capable of beating anyone in the world. And most importantly, they have some of the best wide players in the world, whether it's Kvaratskhelia, Desiree Doué. They have someone like Barcola who can come off the bench, as well as lots of young players in that squad as well. Even someone like Randall Kolomoani returning from loan. Okay, maybe he's not, a player that's ready or good enough for the first team, but still maybe a backup player. So there are some reports that PSG would let Diomande stay at Leipzig for a further season to develop. Do you think that is because they maybe have to make space for him? And I guess if that's the case, who do you think would have to leave PSG to make space for Diomande?
Yeah, so Yan Diomande, he's a very skilled dribbler. He's fast and capable of insulting any defense. His profile actually looks quite similar to Bradley Barcola, even if Barcola tends to attack more depth and run in behind, which only adds the idea that Diomande could become his natural successor on the wing. Bradley Barcola find himself pushed down the pecking order now behind both Kvaratskhelia and Doué on the wing, and that bench role could push him toward an exit, as he legitimately looks for undisputed starter statues everywhere. And it will be a shame given how rare his profile is, in my opinion. But that's Luis Enrique philosophy and PSG philosophy now. Players have to be fully committed to the project, and if it's not the case, the door stays open, and it works in both ways, as I said. And we already have another rumor for the right wing with Marnès Akliouche from Monaco. So yeah, I think PSG they want the best young talents to dominate Europe in the next year. So if you don't want to play for PSG anymore, thanks for everything you achieve with the PSG, but there will be another player who want to play for them. And we also have the case of Ousmane Dembélé. He didn't sign a new contract yet. He's 29 years old, so PSG had to start thinking for the next few years. So yeah, it's they always want the best players. So I think Yan Diomande could be the reason why Barcola may leave PSG.
Who coincidentally has also been heavily linked with a move to Liverpool. So we might find this kind of carousel of players moving around Europe due to this transfer. So we'll be interested to see how it develops and what happens. Hopefully it hasn't gone through by the time this podcast goes live, but even still, Stefan, you've offered some fantastic insight, not only into why Diomande might want to join PSG, but also why PSG seem to be outperforming just about every other club in Europe right now, on and off the pitch. So thank you so much, and I look forward to having you back on the show next time PSG are either winning the European Cup or signing the best player in the world.
Hope so. Thank you.